Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the modern Erilar. In my last episode, I mentioned that ideographic runes, or runes used as the symbol for the word that is their name, sometimes had a magical purpose. Surprisingly few of the practices associated with historical runic writing, as differentiated from modern runic practice, seem to be inherently magical. Most practices can only be suggested as possibly having a magical function. Today, let's elaborate on some of the surviving evidence that has been interpreted by runologists as having a magical function by discussing the runes that appear on amulets. Runic amulets could be pieces of jewelry, metal plates, worked pieces of bone, or sticks of wood that have a runic inscription that fulfills a magical function, such as healing, cursing, blessing, or protection. The majority of these amulets are recovered as stray finds, but those amulets that are pierced, have suspension loops, or are found inside small leather purses can tell us that amulets are intended to stay close to an individual person. Quite a few have been recovered from shallow burials at much older burial mounds within the landscape, and many Norwegian and Swedish amulet finds appear in grave contexts, suggesting deposition in spiritually significant places, or an interest in either protecting the deceased, or in the instances where it is a Christian amulet and a much older, much more likely to be pagan burial mound, this may have been a post facto blessing of the individual inside the burial mound for one of several different purposes. Stephen Pollington agreed with Stephen Flowers that magical texts often depend for their effect on confusing the observer, so that the text is on the one hand present and clearly visible, but on the other it cannot be read. To read the text is to solve the riddle of its making and so undo the spell. Flowers further suggested that communication with the other than human must be encoded to be intelligible to the receiver. One of the ways that rune writers may be able to code their runes is by hiding the intended word. Rune writers can achieve this in a couple of different ways. The first is by jumbling the individual runes that make up the word. We have a great example of this on the Thames sword mount, where a jumble of the name Seidbert appears on either side of a BCA inscription that is itself framed by an Iwas and an Esau's rune. Rune writers could also hide the intended word by adding runes in order to make the word itself less intelligible. Mindy MacLeod and Bernard Mees suggest that the Maglemose and Tunde bracteate inscriptions from Denmark and the Zatmar bracteate inscription from Hungary may contain coded instances of the charm word alu, though they do admit that what the other letters mixed in with these coded charm word sequences signify remains a matter of speculation. Another possible way to differentiate significant text is the presence of multiple repeated parallel strokes within the graph of the rune, such as in the inscriptions from the Kragahul spearshaft, Ödemutland, Lindholm, and here on the Gallehus horn. That's also been suggested as one of these inscriptions. It's possible that rune carvers used repeated stroke runes to set apart words for magical purposes, or significant words from those with a more mundane purpose. On the Gallehus horn, the main part of the text looks a lot more bold because it's got those multiple parallel strokes that make up each line of the rune, whereas the ending verb tawido is just a single stroke for any one of the components of the rune itself, though I would agree that the Kragahul spearshaft, with its very charm-like sequence and bind runes, is much more likely to be of some kind of spiritual significance than the phrase I Levogastes, being somebody's name, who comes from the area of the dry stream bed, made the horn. This may just be a maker statement and not of much more spiritual significance than that. MacLeod and Mees identified specific elements that can make up the text on any given amulet, and they point out 5 components. Item descriptions of the object like brooch or pendant or horn, letter sequences, symbols, naming expressions which can consist either of a name or a more complex phrase such as I am called, and then charms and other operations. I would point out that charms can be either words or phrases, and they're sometimes poetic because they're written with rhyme, alliteration, and meter. Charms which can include invocations of deities, narratives to activate the amulet, or special words that we see repeated over many inscriptions. All of these can be counted as charms of some kind. Not all 5 elements appear on every amulet, but most amulets contain at least 3 of these elements, not all of which have to be interpretable. Rika Steenholt-Olesen, discussing Danish runic amulets, pointed out that fewer than half of the amulets are linguistically meaningful, and she says that it seems to have been of no importance that the inscriptions made sense. She believes that the writing was a necessary feature of the amulet and it performed a function, but it was not intended for communication between individual humans. In my opinion, the inclusion of some kind of intelligible charm is necessary for us to identify with any kind of certainty that we're dealing with an object whose owner actually intended for it to be magical, rather than letting us runic scholars and archaeologists fall back on the convenient phrase ritual significance as a fig leaf for saying we don't know yet. So with that in mind, let's get into these various elements. While the item descriptions on some amulets may seem pretty self-explanatory, like this is a brooch, this is a comb, what have you, not all of the letter sequences are. Some letter sequences that we see repeated on objects interpreted as amulets are the full Futhark rune row itself, either written out with all of its runes or sometimes just the first 6 runes, Fe, Ur, Tors, Os, Ride, Kaun, Futhark. The Sharnai brooch, for example, contains a full Elder Futhark rune row, and then it has a charm sequence, and then potentially a couple divine names as well. So it's got at least 3 of these individual components from the elements that make up an individual amulet. In medieval Scandinavia, the first 3 runes of the Futhark only, Fe, Ur, Tors, also correspond to a word for female genitalia that has been interpreted as a lucky sequence, but I've been in enough public washrooms to point out that not every instance of someone writing a short word or 2 about genitalia is included to be either lucky or protective. So this is neither a necessary nor sufficient explanation for why someone's writing about genitalia and leaving it for posterity. In other instances, letter sequences repeat runes, as we see on the Ellestad runestone, which features repeated Kenals and Esau's runes. Other sequences, like this pendant inscription from Thun, where the runes transliterate to A, Dua, Liui, this forms a pronounceable sequence, and this could be an inherently magical speaking in tongues kind of utterance, kind of like the phrase abracadabra, with which you might be more familiar. Other sequences, like the Lindholm Amulets Side C, the 3rd of the sequences on this particular inscription, so like this rune row here, this is not pronounceable. This is, as it appears going from left to right here, one would not be able to pronounce this sequence. And runologists disagree whether unpronounceable sequences may encode or encrypt additional information within their runes. This particular one may be a depiction of the word tumdnas, which means turned or rounded, and given the shape of the amulet, this might make some intelligible sense, but what it might be able to signify, whether it's turning something around, changing something, making it evolve, that's not necessarily intelligible to us as runic scholars, and other sequences end up being kind of similar. Sophia Peresvetov Morath reads the Oroshilde bronze plate DR246 as featuring sets of Thor's runes that feature multiple bows on either side of the stave, and on the second side, multiple Ur runes that cross over each other. She points out that these are unlikely to have had a lexical meaning, but we do not yet know really what this particular inscription might signify besides I got help for Sigvard. Some symbols within or alongside runic texts, such as sun wheels, triskells, and various tree and arrowhead and tail shapes, may have had magical functions, but they may also have been purely decorative. I've previously mentioned the Skjulverstone, the last item of which is a tree-like shape. Some runologists have suggested that this could be an invocation because of the differing number of strokes to either side of the central stave. You'll notice that there's a differing number on each side. It could be an invocation of 6 instances of the god Tyr and 4 of Onsus, who's either an unspecified god or more specifically Odin. The Damsdorf and Kövel spearheads have both runes and non-runic symbols as part of their ornamentation. MacLeod and Mees have identified some of these as tamgas, abstract signs used by Eurasian nomads to denote ownership or affiliation. This seems to be pretty unique to Elder Futhark inscriptions, and mostly those that are recovered from very Eastern Europe, so keep that in mind. Naming expressions can be as simple as a single name written on the object. They can also be more complex phrases, like that on the Hieland II bracteate from around 500 of the Common Era, which reads, "I am called High Warrior, the one who is wise about journeys. I give good luck." The charm sequences on amulets can take on a variety of forms. Several runic inscriptions on early jewelry bear inscriptions invoking the names of deities in order to either bless an item or to imbue it with power, potentially. You may recall the very exciting news from 2023 of the discovery of a 5th century bracteate with the Proto-Norse inscription Is Vodanas Veras. He is Odin's man, and then Yagas, which may be a name, transliterated by Lisbeth Immer and Christer Vasshus. This might be the oldest incidence that we have of the name for Odin, Wodnas. On the 6th century Nordendorf bow brooch, we get another instance of this name within a divine triad of the names Logathor, Wodan, and Blessing Tunor, or Blessing Thor. The first of these names, Logathor, is probably an old Germanic aspect of Loder or Lothor, one of Odin's companions known also from the Völuspá. I used the Riba skull fragment in episodes 7 and 8 on the Danish Younger Futhark to illustrate the transition from Elder Futhark to the Younger by the beginning of the Viking Age, but I didn't give a lot of detail about the text that it communicated. Its inscription is actually a charm that also invokes a divine triad, again, including Odin and Ulf and High Tyr, and the text then states that they are a help for a name, Bur, probably the name Buri, probably the recipient of this particular amulet, against some kind of a disease that is referred to as pain and dwarf stroke. And this was possibly some kind of a headache, which, given that this is made out of the top portion of a human cranium, may make some interesting kind of sense and have some correspondence with the intended effect of this particular amulet. Some narrative charm elements may activate the amulet or cause an event to occur. This inscription on the 6th century Forsen belt buckle was inscribed with 2 phrases, each 6 syllables long, which contain rhyme, alliteration, and assonance. So both repeated instances of specific consonants and then also repeated instances of specific vowels as well. Egil and Olrun are characters that appear in the first line of the inscription, and they appear in Germanic mythology associated with Wayland the Smith. And so they're part of the heroic world of the sagas of the legendary period during the migration era. A verse which has them searching for an elk could have been added to the belt buckle in order to make the wearer a better hunter. Other narrative charms seem to be intended to facilitate the action described by the inscription. The ström, whetstone, bears a poetic inscription which translates to wet this stone, horn, scathe, scythe, the fallen lie. This seems to describe the successful use of a scythe, a cutting tool that could have been sharpened by the inscribed whetstone, and so the inscription may represent a type of enabling magic, whereby the text on the tool describes a successful outcome in order to bring about that success. That success could also be much more general in nature. I mentioned the Highland bracteate, I give good luck, and the Skoldborg bracteate also bears the legend Auja Aloin, or be lucky Aloin. The word Auja actually appears in many inscriptions as an empowering word or a charm word. So in our next regular episode, let's continue discussing historical runic magic by elaborating on different charm words that appear in many historical runic inscriptions. We'll start with those in Proto-Scandinavian and Old Norse, and then work towards the Latin phrases that appear in these charms. I hope you'll join me then. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the Modern Era.